quarantined a little bit last week, or for the last 2 weeks, but everything was fine. I tested negative and never had any symptoms, but Larry Carter, our president, I had lunch with him one of those days, and so didn't want to take any risk. And then on top of that, he's back now, but his wife, Judy, has since tested positive for COVID, so she's got it now. So, and last I knew, she wasn't having any real problems. In fact, they have horses, and Larry's secretary said she was still out feeding the horses, so she might be okay. Can check with our Larry here, being a farm guy. I do have a quick announcement, though, and this isn't about me, but I guess I'm going to use me for a little bit. And that is John Nugent, one of my friends, Dr. Nugent from Great Lakes, who has been a big influence on me, and especially with the book of Genesis. But he posted something yesterday, and it really struck a chord with me, because I feel like I waste way too much time doing things. And this kind of piggybacks what I read a couple, 2 or 3 weeks ago from somebody, and that was a guy named Ed Page, and he talked about the fact that all the time he wastes over the years to do this and that, and that he could have, in that time, memorized the Bible, read hundreds of books and all different kind of things, and it's just like, why do we waste some time so often? And one of the things I'm going to do, and it's hard because, especially being by myself, I like to talk to somebody, and sometimes the best thing I can talk is on Facebook and different things like that, but I'm going to give that up for a while and really study reading, spending that time reading the Bible. Because he put this graphic on Facebook. So I say I'm not going to use Facebook, but I am for a minute. But he says, he's talking about, he's reading through the Bible right now in 60 days and so on. And it sounds sometimes overwhelming, but what he was talking about is to read the Torah, or, you know, the 5 books, takes 13 hours and 46 minutes. And this is just an average. The historical books take approximately 16 hours and 41 minutes. You can read the writings in 9 hours, you know, the poetry section and so on. And then the prophets in 15 hours and 35 minutes. Really doesn't seem like a whole lot of time, does it? And the New Testament, you can read the Gospels and Acts in 10 hours and 14 minutes, and read through the epistles and Revelation in 7 hours and 30 minutes. And so one of the things he suggested, though, which is really kind of wise, and I know I get bogged down on it sometimes, and maybe this will help you. I think it's going to help me. But to have maybe a spiral notebook or something alongside as you read, he says, because sometimes we get bogged down on different things that we read, and we're trying to search for answers and so on, and it takes us a lot longer and so on. And he suggests just writing down what your question is and just continue to read. And so I don't know if that works for you, and I don't know how well it'll work for me, but I'm going to give it a try. So keep me in your prayers there. I'm going to try to read through the Bible here in the next 2 months. And so we'll see how that goes. I appreciate Rob filling in for me last week, and I know he got through most everything and did a great job, and hopefully I can come close to fulfilling the expectations that he set. But you know, as you finish up chapter 15, we see that God puts some boundaries on the promised land in this account, and he tells Abraham that his descendants will be aliens for 400 years. So all of a sudden we have this foreshadowing of something that's going to happen as far as the Exodus and so on, that right here in chapter 12, find out that, there's going to be famine in the land, descent into Egypt, Sarah is going to be taken into Pharaoh's house, which we know, and later releases her, and all the wealth that they accumulate and so on, that all this is kind of a foreshadow to some of the things that are going to happen later, too, as far as with Joseph, with all the famine and so on, and then how God's people end up going into Egypt, into captivity there for 400 years. And so it'd be interesting, you're kind of looking at history, but at the same time, you're looking at something that's happening in the future, too. And of course, a lot of arguments as far as where exactly when certain books were written and so on. So some of them may have been written even at the time that some of that was happening. Okay, we're ready to jump into chapter 16 then, and so if I can get somebody to, let's just spend a quick minute kind of in review. We've seen these risks, the risks that Abraham was taking and so on, and remember his first one was doing what? And remember his first risk? Taking Lot with him, right? Because that was a commandment that he not take any of his family, right? But he still does. And then the second risk, anybody remember what the big second risk was? What was one of his lies? I'm not doing a very good job of teaching then. Because if there's no learning, there's no teaching. But remember, what did he have, Sarah? What did they tell the Pharaoh? Okay, so that was the second big risk. What was the third big risk? Anybody remember that? Okay, well, that's all right. It's okay, and if you don't remember, it's all right. This isn't the final exam. Later, that'll come. Then that's where you have to worry about it. But he gives away the land. Who does he give away land to? To Lot. And he gives Lot the worst land, right? Because he's less deserving? No, Lot gets the best. And it's interesting because a lot of times when things like that happen, it's because something bad's going on, but there was no famine, anything. In fact, both of them are too wealthy, really, to share the same land together, so they split it up. And in this case, the enemy is not a foreigner, which you usually think about when land gets distributed back then. Somebody came in and took it, right? But in this case, it's just going to his closest kin. The fourth risk we have is that we see Babylon and Persia, talking about Mesopotamia and all of those kind of things, and that's kind of a foreshadow maybe too of what's going to happen in the 6th century when they get exiled. All kind of things that kind of lead up to different things. Now we get ready to look at the big Hagar experiment. So somebody want to read 16 verses 1 through 6? So, and now remember, Sarai and Abram, they don't, we talk about Abraham and Sarah, but their names haven't changed, right? And so it's always good to remember that a little bit, because we'll dig into that a little bit deeper here in just a little bit. But what's the problem here? Sarai is what? She's growing impatient. But she's 90 years old, so maybe that doesn't seem all that unusual. But she's grown impatient. But what becomes the problem right now then? She wants to take matters into her own hands. She's not going to trust God or anything like that. She's going to deal with it the way that she thinks she should deal with it. Now, we would never do anything like that though, right? We would never pray and then, because we don't get what we think we should, or we don't get this answer that we think we should have, we go ahead and start coming up with other ideas. And sometimes they're not all that bad. I mean, this seems to be a little bit worse maybe, but is it worse? Was it? Go ahead. And even in that time period, it wasn't unusual, and it wasn't necessarily because somebody was barren, but wealthy people would tend to have somebody else have their child. And maybe they didn't, they didn't want to lose their beauty, I don't know, but they would oftentimes have their husband impregnate somebody else, and they might look for somebody with specific qualities. I don't know how all that would have worked, but probably wanting somebody beautiful, and so they'd have nice, lovely looking kids. And I'm sure that even in those situations, then there would be jealousy after some of those things happened. All of a sudden, the woman would probably resent the fact that obviously her husband had sex with somebody else, and so on. So what do you think about all of that stuff?
In this case, it wasn't just all that. It was putting the covenant at risk.
Sure.
They were supposed to marry Jewish people, not Egyptian people.
Exactly. And so she wasn't just toying with somebody's estate, which obviously Abraham was going to have a big estate and leave a lot of property and money and all that kind of stuff to someone else, and so on. And so that would have been a factor. But the biggest thing is she's playing around big time with God's covenant. And that supersedes all the other kind of bad things or anything that could result from that. And so we see a couple of interesting observations from this. First, remember, and I know that Rob went through this, do you remember what Abraham complained about to God about not having an heir? You remember who that guy's name was? Something? Eliezer? Why didn't he want him to be his heir? Because he was a slave. I mean, you want to leave things to your children if you can. I don't have any children, and I don't exactly have a real big estate anyway, so it doesn't matter a whole bunch. But I'm leaving, some of my estate here. I'm leaving some of it to Great Lakes and some to his house and different things. And so, but I wanted to go to those places. I don't want it to go, to the state of Michigan or something like that. And so you predetermine those things. But right here, Abraham was upset because he's thinking that his only heir was going to be a slave and that wouldn't happen. But now what does he turn around and do? It's not much different now, is it? I mean, at least the son to him maybe is going to be half his blood, but it's still going to be a slave from a slave, Hagar, and it's going to be a foreigner. So, it's kind of is interesting there. And then secondly, what do you think about Abraham just listening to his wife? I mean, this guy is going to be the father of many nations. And I don't mean to make the situation political, but if we had a king or a president or whatever that we have, you would hope that that person that you put into that office would be a strong leader and would make the decisions and not rely on somebody else to make his decisions. I mean, does that make sense? No. That's a good point. And I think Sarai had pretty good motives initially and probably thought it was a pretty good idea and not filled with evil or anything like that. And I'm probably not even thinking about the fact that they were messing with the covenant. But what is one word that you would insert into this to describe probably the biggest problem as time was progressing? Well, jealousy, I think that's a pretty good word. I think there's another word. Sometimes we make these decisions too, and they're not really godly based, but we think we make them in pretty good, rationale. So, Larry, what did you say? Right. That's a really good point, because sometimes we don't look at it from that standpoint. We kind of look at it from, even though it isn't our side, but we try to identify more on Abrahamic kind of situation. Right. But back to Sarai too, I think this gets us, what happens when we make some really kind of bad decisions? And I guess you'd have to say this is a really bad decision. After a while, we start to feel what? guilty. Don't you think that that was part of Sarai's problem right now too? She's starting to feel guilty about what she perpetuated and got this all rolling. I mean, it's her idea. Who knows what Abraham said to her different times about, later on, maybe he's feeling a little remorse too. And especially if he looks back and thinks about, man, I complained to God about about Eleazar, which if we look back at that a little bit, do you know what, everybody got names back then, Second Joe, and they had a significance. Do you know what Eleazar means? Well, what are the first two letters? El, and in Hebrew, El stands for what? God. And so Eleazar, it actually means man of God. And so that in and of itself sounds like he might have been a better heir almost than Ishmael ends up being in some ways. Who knows? But anyway, so we've got all this problem. But now we say that we got this other issue now. Second, because he listened to the voice of Sarai. And again, we keep seeing these different things echo. What does this echo back to? What story do we remember from Genesis where some guy listens to somebody else's voice? In the garden. Didn't Eve listen or say something, and Adam responded by listening to her? It's like, again, and not, bashing women, but they make these decisions a little bit, and the guys just run right along with it. No real disagreement. And so, I just find that a little bit interesting to deal with. And if you look, the Hebrew words for listen, shema, and voice, call, they're actually identical. They parallel the story and everything. So listening and and the voice. So we have really the same thing. So this really implies right from the start that Abraham was wrong. He was wrong for not questioning his wife. We don't read any evidence, and we see some correspondence between him and God. We don't see him asking God here about what he should do. He didn't have any problem complaining to God about being upset about not having an heir other than Eleazar. Why didn't he consult God about this decision? And we don't know that he didn't. Does that ever play into our lives? Joe. Correct. Somebody want to read verses 7 through 11? now, so we really start to see some more of the story. It wasn't so much now a feud so much between Sarai and Hagar. Hagar is just going to walk away from the situation. So why do you think she would do that? Absolutely, good points. She feels, well, okay. I don't know whether she got on her bike or whatever, how fast she left, but, right. Right. And we can do the same thing. When we get into situations, we run away from them. And sometimes it's not as much literal as it is just walking away or running away. We have problems in our family. What's the quick solution? Divorce. Doesn't, you can say it's not walking away or running away, but yeah, it is. It's moving away from the relationship. You have problems, and sometimes things become necessary, but oftentimes they're not. You have problems with your job. Sometimes rather than to resolve them, you do what? Quit. And again, sometimes maybe that's the best situation, but maybe not always. You have a feud with your neighbor. Quit. You may not move away, but there's an invisible barrier now maybe between your yard and their yard. All of a sudden you don't speak, they're out there working in their yard right next to yours, and you're out there working, and you won't even say hello. Those things happen. People leave the church, and sometimes, it's one of those situations where you just give up. Any thoughts on her leaving? But I think it's well said that she knew that she was probably going to be in a rough situation because she was going to be resented, at the very least, by Sarai, right? Maybe she even feared for the son or whoever she was going to bear. I don't know that she knew that it was going to be a son, but wondering what was going to happen. Good or bad. Maybe she was going to have it taken away and treated well. But do we ever hear stories now of somebody being a surrogate mom and then deciding, once the baby's born, they see the baby and they decide to do what? Not give it up? What happens then? Well, you don't not give it up if if you're in a slave situation, you get your head chopped off probably if you argue too much about it. And so all these things had to be running through her mind. But all of a sudden we also see that what's going to happen? God intervenes. And that was a situation that sometimes people struggle with a little bit in understanding. God, I would think, and I'm not trying to eisegete the scriptures, but he probably wasn't all in favor of this from the beginning. Yet what did he do? In his loving kindness, he wanted to remedy the situation. And he didn't want to just pay her off like sometimes people would do today, or even back then, I'm sure. But he assured her of what? Yes. And he also was going to bless her with a big inheritance kind of thing, too. Right? She was going to be well taken care of. She wasn't going to be a slave girl anymore. So, I think that was a pretty good idea.
So the fact that God sent her back kind of says that God doesn't condone our walking away from problems, doesn't it? He wants us to grow through the problems, not just walk away from them.
I think that's well said, Mark. Did everybody hear that? That sometimes we're tempted to mess up and trying to not mess up what you just said, but so that people can hear it a little better. But we make bad decisions, but instead of just tossing them out with the wash water, God's going to make our mistakes into something much better. And even though he may have not approved of how we handled things, he's going to find a way to remedy the situation. Is that pretty much what you...
When people walk away from a marriage, yeah, they might marry well and they might have a good life with a new spouse, but there's always some tension there. They would have been better off to go back and reconcile and get less selfish and get more God-centered and look at the big picture more and grow some character instead of just repeating the same mistake somewhere else.
Yeah, very good. Because we think sometimes, and maybe I'm treading on thin water here. I don't know if that makes sense. I guess water's always thin. But thin ice, maybe? How's that? Since we're just a month away from ice, probably, on lakes. But we think because we mess up sometimes that we can solve the problem ourselves. And then especially if things tend to work out pretty well, we think, it was no big deal what we did. And we move on. We think, well, like Mark's example, you have a new wife, kind of a new family, and we think, well, we're doing really well, and she remarried, and she's got a nice family now, but you still got kids that their mom's in another house, and then over there, their son, and different things, and it's still not the way God wanted it to be. But that doesn't mean that he's going to just leave us out there. He's going to remedy the situation. Joe?
I think what's really powerful about that part of the scripture is that she wasn't left alone in the wilderness. God sent his representative, and the idea there is that you may be that representative in some way or some sort, and that's the process that you have to go through for the reconciliation. It may take an outside voice. You may be the one that says, to talk to the person that says, hey, things aren't working out really well. Let's go back and give it another try. Let's go back and take care of the situation instead of running away from it. But you're not solving anything by running away. The only way that you can solve the problem is to meet the problem head on. And that was great that God intervened, sent his messenger, the angel, or whoever it was that he sent, and turned her around.
And I think a point, too, is that the writer of this book, I think he's making it a point that in God's eyes, it's not a matter of his people, the Israelites, always being right, and in this case, the Egyptians being wrong. And I think sometimes we look at that. Would we ever think that when we make bad decisions, it's because we were involved with non-Christians, and they're the ones that helped influence us into making the bad decisions? And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen to some degree, But it's easy, was it, who was it? That's true, Joel. But if we look back, who was it that said, I need some help from us other older folks, but the devil made me do it? Flip Wilson. Very good. And it's easy to say that and to hang it on Satan. Does he do that sometimes? Yes. But sometimes we sin because it's not him nudging us, but us desiring to do something wrong. And yet we think, well, no, it was my non-Christian friends that talked me into going out and tying one on over the weekend, and then, I did this and that, and I never would have done it, And so, and the only blame we seem to maybe take is, well, if I surrounded myself just with other Christians, and that wouldn't have happened. But, it's still really not my fault. I mean, most people tend to not want to take blame and be accountable for things. I remember all the days back teaching and coaching. A lot of times you'd confront a youngster and maybe say this and that, and you get them to the point that it's like they finally admit that they did something wrong. However, they always put a but in it too. But still, if so-and-so wouldn't have done this, I never would have gotten involved. And we always want to be, our human nature, unfortunately, because we have a sinful nature, is to find somebody else to blame. And in this case, I think God's pointing out, hey, you are my people, but you're not a perfect people. Don't blame everything on your quote-unquote ungodly neighbors, because it ain't going to work. Did somebody have a statement? Yes.
Going back to Sarah's decision in the first place, she was just looking at the earthly facts. I'm getting old, Abraham's getting old, there's no way this could happen. She's just discounting the promise of God, looking at the natural world. And we do exactly the same thing. We look at the facts, we do our life from an earthly perspective, not a godly perspective, and that's where we get off the rails.
Yeah, we exactly. Which we're going to get into that here in just a second. Somebody want to read chapter 17, like 1 through 16? Take us a few moments, but loud and proud. Go ahead and read through 17. There we go. So Abraham is 100, wife 90. And what does it say that they did? They laughed. Now, would you laugh about something like that? I think it would probably be kind of human nature. You think like, you got to be kidding me. But I don't think God probably took it that way necessarily, because when God's talking to you, I don't think he's joking with you about things. But in human reality, we would think that that's impossible. Well, it hasn't said yet what the name is going to be, but what was going to be the name of the child? We all know it's what? No, he's talking, about the child they're going to have between the two of them. What was his name? Isaac. Do you know what the word Isaac means? Pardon? Actually, it means laughter. It means laughter. So, like I said earlier, names really meant something back then. And so really, you go around and, hey, laughter, come here, buddy. And you go to school and people say, they call attendance and they say, laughter. That would kind of be a joke a little bit, wouldn't it? I mean, you ever had students in your, we're older and most of the people I grew up with had pretty normal kind of names, but some of the students that I started to have the last few years of my teaching, it's like, I don't know where they came up with this name for their child, but it would be kind of interesting to name your kid Laughter. But that's what they did. I mean, and it's like, you promised this kid a long time ago, but God didn't promise them a long time ago that they'd have a child then, just that they would have a son, right? And so, I think that's a little bit interesting. And then all of a sudden we get into this covenant, and what is part of the covenant right now going to be? Circumcision. Now, we look back on it because we live in a society that's an accepted thing, but what would it have been like, you think, to hear about this right now? Painful. And kind of strange. I mean, who would ever think of chopping things up a little bit? I mean, it hadn't been done before. Why all of a sudden does it need to be done now? And we know that maybe for health reasons it was better, but more importantly than anything, it was going to be a what? A sign. And so, and for a child, they would be circumcised on what day? The 8th day. And so, I don't know, what kind of anesthesia they used then, and I don't even know the process now, to be honest with you. But it probably isn't a big painful thing. But when you're a full-grown man, I got to believe that's probably pretty painful. And to go through that, and the interesting part is as we read further into the story, what happens if somebody refused to do it? It's pretty much like no hereafter for you. I mean, you want a ticket into heaven, this is something you have to do. And it was a sign that you were what? Obedient. And so it's pretty interesting. Now we see a name change. Any idea why God changed their names? Yeah. And some would suggest, too, what letter did they add to their names? A what? An H. Now, for Abraham, they added another A, too. But back then, for the most part, in the Hebrew language, they didn't even recognize vowels. Like, in fact, and part of it was because of space when they'd write, on the scrolls and so on. But all you would see is the consonants. And so oftentimes, for instance, if you see Yahweh, it's just YHWH, right? Not spelled out. I mean, if you read it and it's in the Bible and they're using Yahweh, then they're going to spell it out. But they didn't spell out with the vowels. In fact, if you look at a Hebrew Bible today, the vowels are little dots and stuff like that under the letters or maybe above the letters. They're, with the exception of the U, which can get put in the middle with a vav, but you don't care about that stuff. But basically, there's no vowels in between the letters. They may be pronounced in between the letters, but there's no vowels. And so the H is, pronounced as a hey, and if you look at Yahweh, and I don't have a board up here, but we said in English letters it would be YHWH. What is the prominent letter there? Well, there's 4 letters, and a H is used twice. And so some would suggest that maybe that's why the hey or the H is added to both of their names. And that makes reasonable sense. Do we know that for sure? Absolutely not. Don't go home and say that Dan said this, and so you can bet your salvation on it or the house or anything else. But it makes sense because it does parallel that. And the fact that both of them got an H, that it had something to do with not that they were all of a sudden God-like, but if they were going to be the father and mother of many nations, it does seem, I don't know, for lack of a better word, that they were somewhat of royalty a little bit. Does that make sense, or no? Okay. And it's interesting, though, that because who knows that much about it, because they say that really God doesn't involve his name until later, but because in fact, even remember back at the butane bush, we didn't even hear the divine name. What was his name there? I am, right? And so it wasn't Yahweh or anything like that, but it just becomes interesting. Let's see if we can knock off a little bit more here. Somebody want to read? No, Sarah, you don't need to read. Let's not read it because I want to talk about it a little bit. You can read that on your own, some of 18. But all of a sudden, we have this big turning point. We have this angelic announcement, and God comes in, and, you know, he's got all this stuff to kind of deal with. And he announces the conception of Isaac, and he has to deal with, it's interesting, right now we're getting everything set up for all the lines that ultimately lead to Christ and so on. And what problem does he have to deal with in this chapter now? Does God have to deal with? Of all things, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And so that kind of ends up being a mess, and so on and so forth. But go ahead and somebody just read verse 1. I'll read it. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. And verse 2, he looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. Who were the 3 men? Does it tell us right there? Not really. But we'll find out a little bit later that these 3 men were what? God and 2 angels. Pardon? Well, yeah. Probably. Sort of, most likely. Could be. Who knows? I'm not going to throw a percentage on it. But that does appear to be what it is. If we look quickly through a couple more verses, he said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as they have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour. Knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant and hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So all of a sudden, why all the hurry to do all this? And, he knew they were, messengers from God. He's concerned with keeping peace with his neighbors. And, but he's apparently trying to follow custom, which is really important, Old Testament kind of stuff, right? And so what do you see about this? Well, if we look at verse 9, it says, they said to him, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "They're in the tent." One will, then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And so now they're getting into this, and unfortunately we're kind of at the place to cease. It's 10:15, but we're not bad. We're only about a half a chapter behind here. So, Rob, would you go ahead and close us?